Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kate Judson from FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the first of our two-part webinar series, Mitigating Natural Hazard Risks in the Energy Sector, Innovative Projects that Help Build Resilient Communities. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few technical instructions for everyone on the line. First, if you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A pod located under the attendee list on the left side of your screen. We'll be collecting your questions throughout the presentation, and they will inform our Q&A discussion at the very end of the session. I would also like to point out that you can download a PDF of the presentation from the Downloads pod located in the bottom right area of your screen, along with several other resources. Finally, please note that this webinar is scheduled until 4, but depending on how much feedback and questions we receive from you all, we may end up wrapping up a little bit earlier. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Ryan Janda for opening remarks. Ryan?
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ryan Janda, Branch Chief for FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants Division and the Grants Implementation Branch. I'm excited to kick off a series of webinars in partnership with the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Weatherization, and Intergovernmental Programs. Today's webinar is the first in a two-part series focused on energy lifelines, mitigation projects, and metrics. We are so glad you could join us this afternoon and are so grateful for this partnership with DOE. This webinar series is primarily intended for federal, state, tribal, and local community officials who are interested in learning about innovative energy-specific hazard mitigation projects, how to leverage federal grant funding available through FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation grant programs, and resources that are available through the DOE State Energy Program. In today's presentation, you'll hear from several presenters, so I'd like to take a moment to introduce everyone before we begin. We're joined today by Virginia Castro, Technical Energy Project Specialist, and Crystal Lehman, Policy Advisor, both from the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Weatherization, and Intergovernmental Affairs Program. Intergovernmental programs, not affairs, just intergovernmental programs. We're also fortunate to have Jana Gagnon, Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria in California. And also, as you just heard Kate's voice, Kate Judson, Policy Analyst for FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division. So thank you all for joining us today. And they have promised me that if I miss something on one of my slides, that they would be happy to be a lifeline. So I'm gonna hold them to that. Going to the next slide. As you can see, we have a packed agenda here. The objectives for today are to learn about ongoing federal and state-funded energy projects, how to leverage federal grant funding available through FEMA's fiscal year 2019 pre-disaster mitigation grant program, and also to learn about DOE State Energy Program. Furthermore, I'm really happy that Janet can be with us today. Janet will be showcasing Blue Lake Rancheria's low-carbon micro-power grid project. After hearing the three presentations from FEMA, the Blue Lake Rancheria, and DOE in the first hour, we will be fielding your questions. As Kate mentioned, you can submit your questions at any point throughout the presentation via the Q&A pod on the left side of your screen. So if everybody could just take a second to take a look at that pod. We will be able to see your questions here. Not everybody in the webinar will be able to see your questions, but we'll see your questions, and then we'll get those ready for us to take a look at towards the end of the presentation. Following the presentations, we'll also request your feedback on the webinar with a few short poll questions. The questions are optional, but we greatly appreciate your feedback. These questions allow us to make future webinars even better. When people think about FEMA, they usually think about it coming into communities to aid in recovery after a hazard. And although post-disaster mitigation is critical, it's equally imperative to decrease a community's vulnerability before a disaster strikes. For this reason, since its inception 30 years ago, Hazard Mitigation Assistance, or HMA as we call it, expanded to include pre-disaster programs in addition to its initial post-disaster program. We now offer 3 mitigation grant programs: the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which we call HMGP, Pre-Disaster Mitigation, or PDM, and Flood Mitigation Assistance, or FMA. Showcasing a little bit about our funding in 2018. Over HMA's 30-year history, these three programs have provided more than $15 billion to fund mitigation projects. In fiscal year 2018 alone, FEMA delivered over $1.3 billion in pre- and post-disaster mitigation grants. And as you see on the slide in front of you, it breaks down between the FMA program, or Flood Mitigation Assistance, Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program on the right side, and then 406 mitigation funding towards the bottom left. So the HMA programs, as we identified in the previous slide, are FMA, PDM, and HMGP. And amongst those three programs, you can see that it's been a large percentage of the 2018 funding. We also have another unique mitigation opportunity with 406 mitigation. So after a disaster in a presidentially declared disaster, there's often public assistance funding made available. And in some situations, 406 mitigation funding can be made available. So that 30% in 2018 was just from that one program alone. And that program in some years have provided as much as billions of dollars in mitigation funding. So this kind of gives you just a brief snapshot of the funding that was made in 2018. Going to the next slide, in 2019, this application cycle, the cycle that we're in right now, FEMA has made available $250 million in funds for the PDM program. The application period is currently open, and it closes on January 31st, 2020. We encourage you to apply, and we also encourage you to apply before the very last possible moment. Every year, FEMA posts a Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, approximately 2 months in advance of the application period opening. This allows time to inform applicants and sub-applicants about funding priorities and requirements. The FY19 PDM Notice of Funding Opportunity and fact sheet can be found in the Downloads pod below and are also included as links in the resources slide of this deck. So just to take a second to talk about downloads, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the screen you're looking at right now, there's a number of downloads for you to take away from this presentation. We encourage you to download these, take them, share them widely with your friends, and that way we can spread the word a little bit further than just the 66 folks that have called in today. So we're going to use you guys as force multipliers to share with your friends. Going to the next slide, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program. So just a little bit about this program. We're not going to get into a whole lot of the weeds of this program. The Notice of Funding Opportunity that is 20 plus pages long gets into some more of the weeds, as well as our program guidance, which also gets into a whole lot more of the ins and outs of the program. But we're going to give you some highlights today. The Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program is authorized by Section 203 of the Robert T. Stafford Act to provide resources to assist states, tribal governments, territories, and local communities in their efforts to implement a sustained pre-disaster natural hazard mitigation program. This program was authorized in the year 2000 as part of the Disaster Mitigation Act, and has been a very strong program for FEMA for the last 20 years. The goal of the PDM program is to reduce overall risk to the population and structures from future hazard events, while also reducing reliance on funding from actual disaster declarations. The point of this pre-disaster mitigation program is to provide funding so that we can maybe avoid some other future disasters, at least in an ideal state, maybe one day. Funds are awarded on a nationally competitive basis, and there are state set-asides of $575,000 and a tribal set-aside, which I think for the fiscal year 19 cycle, it is $20 million. The Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program funds multi-hazard mitigation projects, infrastructure projects, and also hazard mitigation plans. And typically, the PDM cost share is 75% federal and 25% non-federal, with the ability to increase to 90% federal share for small and impoverished communities. And if you want to find out more about that small and impoverished community definition, you can look it up in either the NOFO or the program guidance that we have for all HMA programs. We can sometimes get ourselves a little tongue-tied with applicants, sub-applicants, applications, and sub-applications. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to walk through some of those pieces. FEMA makes a distinction between applicants and sub-applicants, as well as applications and sub-applications. Applicants are entities which submit applications directly to FEMA. So just repeat that for a second. Applicants are the only entities that can send applications directly to FEMA. There are typically one applicant from each state, and there is typically one applicant from each territory, and then tribes can either, in some cases, submit directly to FEMA, or may choose to submit through a state, or may be required to submit them to FEMA, depending on what state laws and tribal considerations may be present. And typically, the point of contact for PDM applications within the state is the State Hazard Mitigation Officer. And they're the ones that develop applications. Applicants are responsible for managing the program, soliciting sub-applications, ensuring sub-application eligibility, setting funding priorities, monitoring awards and sub-awards, and ensuring compliance with program and grant management requirements. Now let's talk a second about sub-applicants. So there's only one application from each state, and the applicant submits it. So there are usually multiple sub-applications and sub-applicants across that state. I'm just talking about states because it's easier in some respects. Sub-applicants are entities which submit their sub-applications to their respective applicant. Eligible HMA grant sub-applicants include state agencies, such as state energy offices, federally recognized tribes, tribal agencies, and local governments. You can see that federally recognized tribes are included in both categories. Again, that's because Indian tribal governments may have the option to apply for HMA grants through the state as a sub-applicant or directly to FEMA as an applicant. In all cases, though, individuals and businesses are not eligible to apply for HMA funds. However, an eligible applicant or sub-applicant may apply for funding on behalf of individuals and businesses. Quick little example for that. So, say for instance, Pacific Gas and Electric wanted to submit directly to FEMA. That is not possible because in a business or a large corporation like PG&E would either need to apply through the state or through a community to sponsor on their behalf to the state. Same goes for Tom Cruise at 123 Main Street or anybody else. They would need to apply through their local community who would then sponsor that application on their behalf and then submit it to FEMA. Some really fun examples there. So moving on to programmatic requirements, because this is the super duper fun stuff that everybody loves to talk about. So for the pre-disaster mitigation program, we have a number of programmatic requirements. First, a sub-applicant must have participated in a hazard mitigation plan. And again, notice that it says sub-applicant. So that typically means a local community. A local community must have participated in a local mitigation plan and have an adopted Part 201 or 44 CFR Part 201 plan. And that allows them to address reducing risk in their community by doing a risk assessment and setting priorities across what they're going to be doing in terms of mitigation for their community. In some situations, they may also need to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And for that situation, these communities must have, the project must be sited in the special flood hazard area for this requirement to be triggered. So if those of you that know zones for the National Flood Insurance Program, if the community is entirely in an X zone, this isn't a consideration. If, however, they have a combination of X zone, A zone, V zones, and those are all different risk categories across the National Flood Insurance Program through their mapping process, if they were to have a project located in an A zone, even a power project in an A zone, that community must be participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And that ensures that any project that occurs in those areas meets all National Flood Insurance Program requirements. So let's talk about project requirements for a second. First, mitigation projects funded by HMA must be both feasible and effective at mitigating the risks of the hazard for which the project was designed. A project's feasibility is demonstrated through conformance with accepted engineering practices, established codes, standards, modeling techniques, or best practices. Effective mitigation measures funded under HMA provide a long-term or permanent solution to a risk from a natural hazard. For example, a constructed seawall may be properly engineered and technically sound and therefore feasible. The seawall's effectiveness, however, is a function of the height of the wall and its ability to mitigate flooding. The determination of cost effectiveness is typically demonstrated by the calculation of a benefit-cost ratio, dividing total annualized project benefits by total annualized project costs. The second webinar in this series, next Tuesday, will focus on using the benefit-cost analysis to evaluate energy mitigation projects. We very much encourage you to join us next Tuesday in that session to learn more. And finally, all of our projects must meet environmental planning and historic preservation compliance requirements. Oh, more people keeping me honest. Thank you, Margaret. And also, tying back to that mitigation plan comment we made a little bit ago, the project must be consistent with the mitigation plan. Consistency with the mitigation plan in a very simplistic state means that if a subapplicant is looking to perform a flood mitigation project, but the community does not identify flood as a risk in the mitigation plan, they are not consistent. Again, that's very broad. However, if a community was to be looking to do a seismic project of some sort, reducing risk to seismic threat, and they were to have identified the seismic risk in their mitigation plan, then it would be consistent and it would meet that mitigation planning requirement. Thank you. If you are currently new to applying for our grant programs or have been through the process, this outlines the application process. Applicants determine mitigation priorities. State energy offices would be considered a subapplicant. These pieces are developed by the subapplicant through construction estimates, property appraisals, and other technical evaluations. Now let's just take a look at this for just a second. So as you take a look at the slide that's in front of you, there are usually three big components to an application. I'm going to just say real quick, schedule, scope, and budget. Okay, so almost any project you ever put together, you need a scope of work that talks about what you're going to do. You need a schedule that says how long it's going to take to do it with milestones along the way, and then a budget to say how much it's going to cost. And those budgets need to encompass all costs for the project, not just the federal costs, not just the non-federal costs, but administrative costs, RFP costs, or anything else. So those are really critical to the overall project. Subapplicants submit their project or planning sub-application to the applicant for review, and then they review it to make sure that it meets all of our programmatic requirements. And then states prioritize the applications for submittal to FEMA. So we require every state, actually any applicant, not just state, but also tribes as well as territories, to rank all the projects that they submit to us so that we know what is their highest priority. So every state is allotted an allocation, and if they want their project to be considered part of the allocation, which is pretty much, as long as the project is eligible, it is pretty much going to be selected. And that allocation is only $575,000. As long as it meets all of our programmatic requirements, we basically select it. States then rank all their other projects in planning some applications. So FEMA has at least a clue as to what their top priorities are. During our notice of funding opportunity, we put our priorities that are in there that state that for beyond the allocation, I'm all over the place, my apologies, folks. If a state has a lot of hazard mitigation grant program funding available, they're likely probably not going to be a top-tier candidate for pre-disaster mitigation funding. Those that don't have hazard mitigation grant program funding, they are a higher priority for FEMA because they don't have disaster dollars at their disposal. So the ranking process is really important for FEMA to know exactly what are their top priorities, and then Again, we'll look at that during the selection process to make sure that we account for that. Okay. So moving on to the next slide. This list in front of you is not an all-encompassing laundry list of eligible activities. It's a great list, but it's not everything that we might possibly do under the sun. We start off the top of the list with some property acquisition and structured demolition relocation projects, and the reason why we start with that is it's pretty much one of our biggest project types. We work through elevations, reconstructions, and a bunch of other stuff. We'd like to highlight the energy-related mitigation projects listed here on this list, and those would be in the area of structural retrofitting and infrastructure retrofits. We don't have on here other. So if you take a look at our guidance for a second, we have miscellaneous/other, and some of our other program brochures have other as well. Because we want you to realize that if you were to be developing a project that is consistent with a mitigation plan, cost-effective, feasible and effective, reduces natural hazard risk, and meets environmental planning and historic preservation laws, it is likely an eligible project for the pre-disaster mitigation program. So again, this isn't an all-exhaustive list. I'm just looking over some notes for a second. Bear with me. I wanted also to talk a little bit about advanced assistance. So advanced assistance in the bottom right-hand column. In some or many situations, you want to reduce risk to something from a natural hazard, and you don't have all of the data and documentation needed to demonstrate that the project sub-application is eligible. In these situations, we have advanced assistance. Advanced assistance plays a unique role in project development. I look at advanced assistance as the tool, or at least a tool, that moves a project from the planning phase to the implementation phase. It provides seed money for project scoping. In a lot of situations, especially for flood projects, there's a whole lot of detailed hydrological information that might be needed. And the same probably falls true also within the power sector. So for instance, if we're looking to do a power project to mitigate the risk of a power loss or power failure, we might want to know the number of customers that are part of the overall power system or might be impacted by that proposed project. If that data isn't available right now, advanced assistance could help with gathering that data. So that community would request FEMA funding, likely partner with a consultant. That consultant would then gather that data and then charge back to that sub-applicant the cost for getting those pieces. So again, advanced assistance plays a fantastic role in trying to just get a little bit more of that documentation and data needed for there to be a fantastic project, and likely one that is more eligible, or at least eligible, for us to look at, and then we'd rank it against our priorities, and then hopefully select it. So going to an example project. This project is from the United States Virgin Islands. The USVI faces a serious threat from hurricanes, thunderstorms, and resulting shoreline flooding and surges. To ensure that the USVI's electric lifeline can better withstand disasters, in 2017, the Virgin Island Water and Power Authority, the subgrantee, worked with the USVI and probably their Office of Emergency Management to submit a PDM application for a project to replace the existing aerial overhead electrical distribution system with an underground electrical distribution system. That is a mouthful, by the way. FEMA provided funding for this project because of its ability to demonstrate that it will reduce damages to electric infrastructure by 90%. The project will directly impact at least 500 consumers in the Frederiksted area and help mitigate outages for the 20,000 people on Feeder 8B. The project entails the construction of 2,000 feet of underground conduit and infrastructure to replace the aerial transformers and poles with pad-mounted transformers. This also involves construction of conduit from the transformers to the meters at each building. Installation of 15,000 feet of cable will be required for this step. Before I move on, though, I found another really cool statistic about some of the power projects that we did in the USVI. Surprise for the ladies in the room. Since 1995, FEMA has awarded at least 15 projects to the USVI to move overhead power lines to underground. These projects were immensely successful after Hurricanes Irma and Maria devastated the USVI. FEMA's federal share for these projects was over $21 million. So after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and I'll just spend another couple of seconds kind of just talking off the cuff a little bit, we heard many success stories about how power was restored in certain areas across the islands that would not have happened if it hadn't been for the underground power. So and a lot of the folks that are on the webinar, and as well as the folks in this room, understand the importance of power in a post-disaster environment. Lives are often at least made better when there's power, if not lost, if that made any sense. But power plays a very critical role in disaster recovery, and I think having these kind of projects as a testimony of good, successful mitigation just makes us stronger for it. So I think I'm going to move over to Kate Judson now, our policy analyst in HMA, to continue with our discussion on lifelines. Kate, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. So you've probably heard the term lifelines thrown around a bit, and if you haven't, that's okay, because I want to make sure we all have sort of a clear understanding and are on the same page when we use the term lifelines. So what are lifelines? Simply, or maybe not so simply put, we say it's something that provides indispensable services that enables the continuous operation of critical business and government functions and is really essential to human safety, health, or economic security. So when lifelines are disrupted, impact to survivors can cascade. The lifelines construct or concept was developed by FEMA's response team. But that being said, here in mitigation, we're trying to connect it to all stages of the disaster life cycle. So not just in the response phase, but also lifeline should be considered when engaging in pre-disaster mitigation efforts as well. And the thought is, by investing in projects that target community lifelines, we're going to reduce the need for stabilization of that lifeline post-event. So as you can see up on the screen, there are 7 lifelines, and they range from things like food, water, and shelter. There's a whole energy lifeline and transportation. And within or under those 7 lifelines, there are components that make up those broad lifeline categories. And when we mitigate against lifelines, it really helps communities bounce back more quickly, and they'll be able to be more resilient to both acute shocks and stressors that they may face. So simply put, we like to think about mitigation and lifelines as mitigating risks to lifelines before, during, and after disasters may result in less devastation, and response and recovery efforts may be faster and more effective. And the idea behind using this common lifelines language as an agency and across the country is that it really allows decision makers to prioritize and speak the same language so that we can all communicate more effectively. So we're often asked, are there specific lifelines mitigation projects and specific lifelines mitigation project types? And the answer is really no. Instead, we like to think of lifelines mitigation projects in much broader and holistic terms and through the lens of criteria. And so there's 3 main criteria we use to define a lifelines mitigation project. I'm just going to go over those super briefly. The first is lifelines mitigation projects should require deliberate planning. Secondly, they should consider cascading impacts of the project. And then last, the project should impact a significant portion of a community. So I just wanted to highlight an example of a lifelines mitigation project. And this one actually comes from New York City, or the Big Apple. And it's NYU's Langone Medical Center. And I think it's a really strong example of how FEMA has already started to take a lifelines approach to mitigation. The NYU Langone Medical Center experienced significant damage as a result of Hurricane Sandy. And not only did flooding hamper its ability to serve the community, but there was also a massive power failure. that caused the loss of years of cancer research and unfortunately millions of dollars as well. So the university responded by developing and implementing a holistic campus-wide mitigation strategy that did include public assistance 406 mitigation to minimize the impact of similar future events. And so some of the resulting projects included constructing a flood barrier to shield the campus buildings and also funding a cogeneration plant. And this cogeneration plant protected the center's power supply and ensures uninterrupted medical treatment and research. And so these activities as a whole use mitigation funding to safeguard multiple lifelines. And I think that's the key thing here. It's oftentimes you fund one project, but it impacts multiple lifelines. So for this particular project, the health and medical lifeline was impacted, as well as the energy lifeline and the safety and security lifelines. So that's 3. The project works across several forms of lifelines, like I said, and it really does improve national resiliency. And if you join next week's webinar, here's another plug for it, next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, you're going to hear more about how FEMA's benefit cost analysis tools allow you to account for the multiple benefits a project offers. So just like multiple lifelines are impacted in this one project, the BCA toolkit allows you to account for the multiple benefits that a project may entail as well. So thank you. I'd like to now turn it over to Jana Gagnon, Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria. Jana?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
All right. Thank you so much. So my name is Jana Gagnon. I'm the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria Tribe, and I'm very pleased to join this important and timely conversation about energy lifeline mitigation, some of the ways that we make our community more resilient. Just a couple of notes about the Blue Lake Rancheria Tribe. We do serve on the Department of Energy's Office of Indian Energy, their National Working Group for Energy Development, and other climate, energy, and infrastructure advisory roles at the national level and with the state of California. For its work pairing climate and energy mitigation with resilience, the tribe has been recognized with FEMA's Whole Community Preparedness Award and as a climate action champion by the Department of Energy. So in preparation for this event and this webinar, I was asked to speak about how our energy mitigation projects came about. So the driving forces for us are the climate crisis as an overlay to our regional context. And we combined climate and regional issues with old-fashioned focus on continuity of operations, emergency preparedness, community health, and supports for the tribe's economy. All these converge into our strategic thinking about how to best tackle energy. And so I just want to talk a little bit about our location and some of the specifics there. The Blue Lake Rancheria is a tribal government and community located in far northwestern California. This is a rural and geographically isolated area. I say this often, people think of Northern California as San Francisco, but you go to San Francisco and then you drive 6 hours north to our region and you're still an hour and a half south of the Oregon border. So we like to say that we're the true Northern California up here. But it has its pros and cons. We describe this region's tenuous utility connections to the outside world as, quote unquote, behind the redwood curtain. So for example, we have one 10-inch natural gas pipeline and two 115 kV power lines that serve most of Humboldt County. The power lines run through wildfire country, and all of our infrastructure sits in an area of very high earthquake and tsunami risk. Further, of course, climate change is amplifying our historic threats and vulnerabilities in terms of sea level rise, drought, and the warmer soils, higher temperatures, drier conditions, and more volatile weather that is leading to these mega wildfires we're experiencing throughout the West, and particularly in California. These impacts are not a surprise. These conditions have been studied and projected for decades, and the tribe has incorporated these facts and implemented strategic plans with climate-smart solutions at their core. So within our strategic plans, we take, as was mentioned just prior, a lifeline sector approach to prioritizing projects. And we define those lifeline sectors in a similar way: energy, water, food, transportation, and communication. And of course, those sectors aren't silos. They overlap in many ways, and all of them are designed to improve community health and achieve economic opportunity. The tribe started with improving the energy lifeline sector first because power supports all the other lifelines. And we understand the changing environment and the disruptions that the climate crisis poses, and we are actively focused on the need for resilience and continuity of operations. Further, and I think this is important, we are working hard to change our thinking to ensure that our emergency preparedness projects, our infrastructure hardening, and other activities are also ideally zero carbon with a zero net greenhouse gas emissions, because our solutions to deal with climate issues should not make the underlying climate problem worse. And so the tribe has set a goal of zero net carbon emissions by 2030, in line with what the experts tell us is the timeline we have to meet. So I'm going to talk a bit about microgrids today, but I want to mention that energy efficiency is always our first step before constructing more complicated and costly systems. Though retail costs of electricity are at times and in places high in California, it should also be noted with every conversation about that the state has some of the lowest average household energy bills in the United States because of its deployment of energy efficiency. So we do that first. Then we figure out how much microgrid to build. So the tribe has 3 microgrids currently. Our community scale microgrid has been in operation for 2 years. I'm going to talk in detail about how that works. Our facility scale microgrid is in the last stages of commissioning. It should be fully online either this week or next week. And our campus scale microgrid, which is in design and will be coming in 2020. These nested or clustered microgrids provide us with also on-site redundancy. If one microgrid goes down, the others can uphold our government programs and economic enterprises. So the first project we did was our community microgrid. And before I go any further, I just want to say that microgrid is a popular term in many circles in resilience and energy arenas. But what is it really? We describe them as a mini electrical grid that can disconnect from the larger regional electricity grid and generate and use its own electricity for as long as needed. When we are operating separate from the bigger grid, it's called islanded mode. So we have our mini electrical grid that is an electricity island. And we operate in islanded mode when the larger grid is out, like we have recently seen in our region with these preventative public safety power shutoffs, which I'll talk about in more detail. Then when we want to, we can reconnect to the larger electrical grid. And when we are connected, it's called grid-connected mode. Grid-connected mode is how this system operates in business as usual when there isn't an emergency situation. And in business as usual, our microgrid helps us reduce costs of electricity and use more green power. Green power in our case is solar photovoltaics, solar PV, paired with large-scale lithium-ion battery storage. Our microgrids also help us take pressure off the larger grid by providing a larger portion of our own power through generation on site. This helps with demand response and just evening out grid functions. And last but certainly not least, it saves the tribe about $200,000 a year on electricity costs and lowers greenhouse gases by about 200 tons per year. These projects come about by public-private partnerships led by the tribe and the Schatz Energy Research Center at our local university, which is Humboldt State. But these partnerships that lead to these microgrids have a number of stakeholders and contributors, including several Department of Energy national labs. The project was funded by the tribe and an energy research and development grant from the state of California's Energy Commission. And of course, our microgrid, this community-scale microgrid, powers a 6-building core campus of the tribe's government offices and economic enterprises, and the critical infrastructure that serve those facilities. I can talk a little bit about the microgrid brain or control system. It's programmed to do a number of functions for us, including controlling energy rate tariffs. So when we get a new time of use rate for electricity, we can just enter it into our system, and the microgrid will automatically optimize its subsystems for economic and environmental benefits. It's a huge leap forward, I think, in the way that these systems can operate. And then I can't say enough about solar photovoltaics and battery storage as a generation investment. They are low cost. They have low greenhouse gas emissions. They are relatively simple to operate and maintain. They are robust in terms of resilience and security, and our fuel is free every day. We don't have to worry about deliveries of the sun arriving or not. So our first microgrid works so well that we are building others. Our latest microgrid is for our fuel station and convenience store. Now, when we think of gas stations with convenience stores, we don't often think of the lifeline sectors they can provide in emergencies, which of course is indeed all of them. Gas station convenience stores can provide energy, water, food, transportation, and communications, but they can't provide these services if they don't have power. So this facility microgrid seeks to create a replicable resilience package for these types of buildings to lower costs and green the grid and business as usual, and then provide for robust long-term emergency power in situations where the larger grid is out. This microgrid at the gas station is similar to the tribe's community scale project in that it's been constructed due to an extraordinary partnership. It's also powered from solar PV and lithium-ion battery storage, and was funded by the tribe and the California Energy Commission's Research, Development, and Deployment Fund, and that's called the Electric Program Investment Charge, or EPIC program. The emergency services role of these facilities is especially important in rural areas where a gas station and convenience store complex may be the only community resource in a large geographic area. So we want to talk a little bit about how these systems are working in a real emergency. And the answer to that is that they're working well. To combat wildfire risk that is present throughout California right now, utilities here are shutting down the electrical grid in dry, hot, windy conditions that could result in the electrical grid causing a wildfire. These are called public safety power shutoffs, and there have been 2 such events in October alone. To give you a sense of scale, both of these shutoffs impacted about 30 counties at one time, with millions of people without power. The length of these outages were about 1 to 6 days, depending on the area. And due to our microgrids, the tribe was able to provide emergency and other services to a significant portion of our region, which was entirely without power. And I'll just go over a few highlights of how these functioned. We were able to ration fuels and serve thousands of individuals and dozens of emergency response agencies. The tribe provided critical medical housing in its hotel for people who needed power for medical equipment and was credited by Health and Human Services with saving 4 lives. We housed wildfire evacuees, families who evacuated only to find that the power was out over wide swaths of the state. They found refuge at the Rancheria. Our electric vehicle charging stations were an important resource. Humboldt County has a high relative adoption rate of EVs, and in the outage, people came to the Blue Lake Rancheria to charge. We opened community and business centers where people could come charge devices, of course obtain food and water and other necessities, but local businesses could also continue to operate with access to power and the internet. Our county paper of record, for example, came to the Rancheria to publish, and we worked with community clinics to keep medicines refrigerated and stable. So microgrids are proving the effectiveness of combining climate action and reliability. And when we do that, we provide equity, resources for all, with the ability to prioritize emergency responders and those most in need. As the climate crisis changes conditions, it is causing social and economic disruptions, as we just talked about. And from an equity standpoint, disadvantaged and vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted. So in our view, we are out of time for supporting anything but proven zero carbon emission energy. We need energy and electrified transportation to transition to zero emissions in the moment as fast as possible. And based on our energy mitigation experience and research, some lessons learned and best practices have emerged. So we want to continue solar and wind at all scales with and without storage. Especially important is the economic opportunities these energy technologies create, especially in rural environments. Solar and wind industry job creation is unparalleled, and the fastest growing jobs through 2026 are solar installer and wind technician. Jobs coupled with the relatively low cost of these types of energy will speed our transition to a sustainable climate smart society. And I'll just add that one new energy focus in our region is floating offshore wind. The resource and capacity factor is extremely promising, and we look forward to the climate and economic benefits that that industry could bring to our region. And I have to talk about one side note on energy mitigation. There is, in certain circles, a new focus on nuclear energy at smaller scales, so-called modular systems. As a cautionary tale, I just want to point out that the first commercial nuclear plant in the United States was and is located in Humboldt Bay, 20 miles from my desk. It cost $33 million to construct in the 50s and 60s, and it has cost over $1 billion with a B to clean up and manage to date. And this is a quote-unquote small site. Now it's a nuclear waste repository. It's a security issue and a continuing economic and environmental burden on this community and other stakeholders for millennia. So nuclear is touted as zero carbon emission, and we all well understand the need for zero emission power, but we have far better solutions in terms of solar, wind, and other forms of energy. Just lastly, some quick thinking about microgrids themselves. They do create stacked benefits: job, climate mitigation, pollution reduction, resilience, and grid management and transition solutions. And now that we've proven the benefits, we need to think about how microgrids are best built, deployed, and valued, especially the value we place on reliability and resilience in outages and other emergencies. So we need to think about how best to manage, operate, and maintain microgrids in coordination with the larger grid, and in light of differing local capacities and expertise. We are working hard to build attendant workforce development and STEAM education programs that focus on the energy, transportation, and other lifeline sectors so that we build real continuum of expertise and capacity in rural areas. And we need to pay attention to that. And then we also need to figure out how to transfer knowledge about microgrids to avoid inappropriate technologies and to lower costs of these systems via more standardization. Increasing funding for research and development for energy mitigations that include zero carbon approaches is needed right now, and it's a wise investment, as we have seen. We've certainly put R&D funding to good use at the Blue Lake Rancheria, where the applications have resulted in real improved energy resilience in both business as usual and in emergencies. And so just to quickly conclude, this is an era of unparalleled focus on the nexus of climate, energy, and resilience, and developing a coordinated strategy to transition to a climate-smart energy sector and society. The private sector is joining because the economics of transitioning to zero-emission energy sources are aligning quite well. We need bold, clear action to clean up our energy sector and to power these other lifelines. And we're already seeing success, and we look forward to much more as fast as possible. So we'll have Q&A at the end of the presentations, but if there are other questions, please don't hesitate to email me at my address here. And thank you for your kind attention. And now I will hand the virtual microphone over to Crystal Lehman. Thank you.
And before we let Crystal take over, I want to just mention really quick that if you have any questions at all, please go ahead and submit those in the Q&A pod on the left side of your screen. We received a few questions, but not all that many. So if you guys have any questions, any burning questions or any thought-provoking questions, go ahead and submit them there, and then we'll talk about those when we're done. Turning it back over to Crystal.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to FEMA for this joint effort. My name is Crystal Lehman. I'm a policy advisor at the Strategic and Interagency Initiatives team at the U.S. Department of Energy. I will be joined today by my colleague, Virginia Castro, a technical energy project specialist from SEP, the State Energy Program, also at the U.S. Department of Energy. Kate did a great overview of the lifelines, but we will take a closer look at the energy lifeline in the center. Lifelines are designated to highlight priority areas and interdependencies, as Kate mentioned, and there are also lifeline components, which include essential elements of information, as you can see here. And that includes the power grid, temporary power, and fuel. Within the temporary power position, we see the status of critical facilities as well as availability of temporary power resources as a core component of one of the energy lifelines. Lifelines are important for mitigation and recovery. The best way to invest in lifelines is to include them in a state, local, tribal, or territorial mitigation plan. Mitigation plans help decision makers understand their risk from natural hazards and prioritize actions that will reduce the impacts of future events. Plans become a great source for mitigation projects when funding becomes available, either from FEMA or Department of Energy. In addition, it is important to note that at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Energy leads the Emergency Support Function 12, ESF 12. Because of the department's energy expertise, ESF 12 is activated to assist on energy issues during extreme weather events. This activity also connects with FEMA's energy lifelines. The U.S. Department of Energy is a large federal agency, and it's important to note that this organization chart is not representative of the entire Department of Energy. It simply illustrates where our office fits in. The mission of the Department of Energy is to ensure America's security and prosperity by addressing its energy, environmental, and nuclear challenges through transformative science and technology solutions. And while Department of Energy has many functions, we'll focus today on Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office, which consists of three main program offices: Office of Transportation, Office of Energy Efficiency, and Office of Renewable Power. Within Office of Energy Efficiency is the weatherization intergovernmental programs where we sit. However, Again, it is important to note that there are many offices focused on resiliency, including the Office of Electricity, which is not listed but plays a very important role in resiliency. For the next section, Virginia Castro from State Energy Program will walk through the Weatherization and Intergovernmental Program and the State Energy Program and talk through an example of how the State Energy Program funded a project in Puerto Rico utilizing solar and storage that complements the FEMA Energy Lifelines.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. I'm Virginia Castro, a project officer with DOE's State Energy Program. And as Crystal has stated, I will be providing an overview of the Weatherization in the Intergovernmental Programs Office, WIP, and focus specifically on the State Energy Program. Then we'll transition to showcase a couple of innovative projects from our program that illustrate how energy efficiency and renewable energy can be utilized as part of mitigation measures against natural disasters and ultimately serve to enhance energy resilience. As an office, WIP supports DOE's strategic objective to create greater energy affordability, security, and resiliency, and is comprised of the State Energy Program, which provides funding and technical assistance to states, territories, and the District of Columbia to enhance energy security, advance state-led initiatives, and maximize the benefits of energy efficiency. We'll discuss this in detail later on. The next program is the Weatherization Assistance Program, which also provides funding to states, territories, and the District of Columbia and aims to reduce the cost of energy for low-income households by increasing energy efficiency in homes. Then we have the Partnership and Technical Assistance Team, which aims to cultivate diverse partnerships that catalyze energy efficiency within states, local governments, and the K-12 sectors. And last but not least, we have the Strategic and Interagency Initiatives Team, which my colleague Crystal Lehman is from, which serves to help states and local governments meet energy objectives for underserved communities, and also leads the Federal Interagency Collaborative for Energy Solutions. Collectively, WIP's activities result in saving taxpayer dollars, increasing energy efficiency, supporting job creation, improving energy security through leveraging all types of energy resources, which ultimately further the development and protection of the nation's energy infrastructure. The State Energy Program directly supports these activities by providing funding to state energy offices through its formula grants. It's important to note that as part of the requirements for this funding, state energy offices are required to have an energy emergency plan for supply disruptions. State energy offices are also able to leverage state energy, SEP funding to develop and execute on these plans. This funding includes support for the state energy offices to prepare for disasters through exercises and also to respond to natural disasters. Operating on a budget of roughly $55 million a year, this slide illustrates the funding flow and resources available for our state. We function across a wide spectrum of energy projects that range from state energy plans to energy education and outreach to energy emergency planning and resiliency. Which brings us to our featured presentation of two state energy projects that come from Puerto Rico and Florida. Both of these projects underscore how energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies can be utilized as mitigation against power loss as a result of natural disaster, while also enhancing energy resilience of buildings. As we heard earlier from our colleagues at FEMA, structural building retrofits are potential eligible projects for FEMA funding. And these examples align with FEMA's Energy Lifeline. And states can potentially leverage federal funds across both Department of Energy's State Energy Program and FEMA's program in accordance with each respective agency's requirements to enhance energy resiliency and to mitigate against natural disasters. On September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a strong Category 4 hurricane with a maximum sustained winds of 155 miles an hour. This resulted in unprecedented destruction across the entire island.
1.5 million customers were out of power, and it took months for power to be restored. In the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, the Department of Economic Development and Commerce, Puerto Rico State Energy Program, began developing a residential energy resiliency solar program. In 2018, about $240,000 of SEP funding was invested into this project. The objective was to increase residential energy resiliency while also reducing energy consumption from the grid. There were 20 homes selected for this project, mainly in Arecibo and Caguas. And it was based on the following criteria. Homes had to have been previously weatherized by Puerto Rico's weatherization program. They needed to be located in areas where the energy grid showed extreme vulnerability. They also needed to be located out of flooding zones and homes that were without power for more than 60 days. The participants in this project also agreed to voluntarily send monthly electricity bills to be evaluated. In total, 54 kilowatts of photovoltaic solar was installed, about 3 kilowatts per home, and 4 battery units as well. The total battery cycling capacity was 80 hours per home based on the manufacturer's specs. As a result of this project, participants were able to report a reduction of 10 to 15 kilowatt hours per month on average. And as part of a qualitative assessment, participants were asked about the benefits they see in having this system installed in their homes. Participants have reported feeling safer and confident in having electricity when there's another major power outage. This is particularly important for residents who are elderly or have medical needs and need access to medical equipment. Overall, this project improved the energy resiliency of the home, as well as increased the passive survivability, which refers to the ability of a building to maintain critical life support conditions for its occupants for an extended period. And this is just one example of a project that serves to support FEMA's Energy Lifeline. And with this, I'd like to hand this next presentation over to my colleague, Crystal Lehman, to speak about Florida. Here we will talk about Florida as another example of how energy efficiency and renewable energy can be utilized as a mitigation measure to enhance energy resiliency, especially in the wake of power outage. Many schools are the first in line to serve as a shelter during an extreme weather event. Florida was proactive and recognized the need for these critical facilities to be prepared for any future extreme weather events. The Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, who is the prime state agency to receive DOE State Energy Program funds, planned out how to outfit K-12 schools throughout Florida with solar and battery storage. The project cost roughly $9 million and leveraged an additional $1 million from Florida utilities to complete the installation of solar and battery storage to 117 schools. The total capacity installed was 1 megawatt, which produced an average of 12 megawatt hours annually. In addition to the installations, educational kits were provided to teachers to teach STEM education to students on renewable energy and provide teachers and facility managers with workshops to better understand the benefits of the installation. As we heard from FEMA earlier, building retrofit is identified as a measure that has been deemed eligible for FEMA funds and also integrates into the Energy Lifeline. When it comes to critical facilities, such as an emergency shelter, the activities Florida and Department of Energy engaged in also supports FEMA's Energy Lifelines. And while the SunSmart program does have an energy cost savings for the schools, the primary goal of this project was to provide adequate shelter for Floridians in the event of a disaster. And it indeed showed itself serving its purpose during 4 hurricanes. During Hurricane Irma, 40 of the SunSmart schools' e-shelters were activated in September 2017. 32 of the schools lost power. However, utilizing the battery storage for backup power, more than 10 hours of power was provided until the grid is fully restored. The project showcased that the installations provided during power was successful in mitigating against the storm. In addition, the educational outcomes led to over 450 Florida teachers and 50,000 students to receive education on renewable energy technology. The projects in Puerto Rico and Florida are innovative mitigative projects that are cross-cutting and aligned with FEMA's energy lifelines. And while both of these projects were funded by Department of Energy's State Energy Program, due to the fact that they align with FEMA's energy lifelines, they could have been eligible for FEMA mitigation funds as well. Of course, it is important to note that leveraging DOE or FEMA funds for resiliency efforts is dependent on state preferences and in accordance to respective federal programs. And with that, we'd like to thank you for your time. And please feel free to contact myself or Virginia Castro with our contact information provided. We would love to hear from you. We'd like to thank everyone for their time again and transition back to FEMA for the question and answer section of the webinar.